An old man was alone in a park when a kind woman gave him company. 1 week later, the woman approaches the man again, but this time the old man had an old picture that moved the woman to tears. Walter Jenkins adjusted his worn tweed cap against the spring breeze as he lowered himself onto the familiar wooden bench. The same bench he'd occupied nearly every afternoon for the past 3 years, ever since Margaret had passed. A creature of habit, Walter arrived at precisely 2:15 p.m., positioned his walking cane against the armrest, and unfolded the day's newspaper, though he rarely read it. Riverside Park hummed with the ordinary symphony of an April afternoon. Children shrieked with delight at the playground to his left. Young mothers pushed strollers along the winding path, and occasional joggers pounded past, their wireless earbuds sealing them inside private worlds of music and motivation. Walter observed it all with the quiet detachment of someone watching life through a window. At 78, Walter had grown accustomed to invisibility. Retirement from teaching high school English had gradually erased his sense of purpose, and Margaret's death had stolen whatever remained. Their modest ranch-style home on Maple Street had become a museum of memories he both treasured and avoided. Their daughter, Catherine, called faithfully every Sunday from Seattle, but the conversations felt increasingly performative. Catherine filling silences with stories about her children, Walter responding with rehearsed interest. Tuesday, Walter muttered to himself, pulling a small plastic container from his jacket pocket. He sorted through his daily medications with practiced fingers, then swallowed them with water from his dented metal flask. The park had witnessed this ritual hundreds of times. A young couple passed by his bench, hands intertwined, laughing at some private joke. Walter found himself staring at their retreating figures, trying to remember when he and Margaret had last walked that way, so lost in each other that the world around them disappeared. 30 years ago? 40? The afternoon sun slanted through the newly budded trees when Walter noticed a woman approaching his bench. She appeared to be in her early 30s, dressed in practical navy slacks and a light cardigan, her brown hair swept into a casual ponytail. What caught Walter's attention was that she wasn't staring at a phone or rushing past. Instead, she met his gaze directly and smiled. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, gesturing to the empty space beside him. Her voice carried a gentle cadence that reminded Walter of someone, though he couldn't place who. Walter blinked, momentarily disoriented by the direct address. "I suppose it's a free country," he replied, then immediately winced at his gruffness. Years of solitude had rusted his social graces. If the woman was offended, she didn't show it. She settled onto the bench, placing a small lunch bag between them. "I'm Diane," she offered, unpacking what appeared to be a simple turkey sandwich. "I work at the community center down the street. Sometimes I need a break from the fluorescent lights." Walter nodded, unsure how to proceed. Conversation with strangers had become a forgotten skill. "Walter," he finally said. "Walter Jenkins." "Nice to meet you, Walter Jenkins," Diane smiled, taking a bite of her sandwich. After chewing thoughtfully, she broke the silence again. "Do you come here often?" The question's simplicity almost made Walter laugh. If only she knew how this bench had become the centerpiece of his diminished world. "Every day," he admitted, "weather permitting." "It's a good spot," Diane observed, nodding toward the expansive view of the park's sloping lawn and the river beyond. "You can see everything from here." Something about her unpretentious manner loosened the knot of isolation that had tightened around Walter over the years. I was a teacher, he found himself saying, surprising himself with the disclosure. High school English. You develop a habit of watching, evaluating, can't seem to shake it, even in retirement. Diane turned toward him with genuine interest. How long did you teach? 42 years. Lincoln High, over on the east side. Her eyebrows rose. 42 years. That's impressive dedication. Walter felt a small flicker of pride he hadn't experienced in years. Taught nearly 3 generations in some families. Had grandchildren of my first students before I retired. What was your favorite thing to teach? Diane asked, offering him half of her sandwich with a gesture so natural that Walter accepted it without thinking. Poetry, he answered without hesitation. Specifically, Robert Frost. Everyone always focuses on the road not taken, but there's so much more depth to his other works. Walter took a bite of the sandwich, realizing it was the first food he'd shared with another person in months. His own lunches at home were perfunctory affairs, often consisting of whatever required the least preparation. Would you recite something? Diane asked. I've always enjoyed poetry, but I never had teachers who made it come alive. Walter hesitated, then cleared his throat. The words came back to him as if he'd taught them yesterday. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. His voice, initially wavering, strengthened with each line, and for a moment, Walter was back in his classroom, 30 eager faces looking up at him, waiting for his explanation of Frost's deceptively simple language. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening, Diane said softly. That was beautiful. Walter nodded, slightly embarrassed by the performance, but pleased she recognized it. Most people think it's just about a man admiring snowy woods, but it's really about the tension between the desire to escape, to surrender to beauty or death, and the obligations that pull us back to life. The words hung in the air between them, suddenly too personal, too revealing. Walter looked away, focusing on a squirrel darting up a nearby oak tree. Diane seemed to sense his discomfort and gently changed the subject. Do you have family nearby, Walter? A daughter in Seattle, Catherine. She's a pediatrician. He reached for his wallet and extracted a slightly bent photograph of a woman in her 40s, standing with 2 children. These are my grandchildren, Emma and James, 12 and 10 now. This picture's a bit outdated. Diane studied the photo, commenting on how Emma had Walter's eyes. The observation startled him. No one had mentioned the resemblance before, and the recognition of this genetic thread linking him to future generations stirred something deep within his chest. For the next hour, Walter found himself talking more than he had in months. He told Diane about Margaret, their 53 years together, how they'd met when he accidentally spilled coffee on her dissertation notes in graduate school, how she'd forgiven him only after he retyped 3 damaged pages on his own typewriter. He described their modest travels, their garden, their Sunday tradition of crossword puzzles completed in tandem. In turn, Diane shared snippets of her own life, her work with at-risk youth at the community center, her apartment downtown shared with an elderly rescue cat named Professor, her love of historical documentaries. Her listening had a quality that Walter recognized from his own best days as a teacher, genuine curiosity without judgment or impatience. When Diane finally glanced at her watch and said she needed to return to work, Walter realized the afternoon had slipped away. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the park, and the playground had emptied of all but a few determined children. It was a pleasure meeting you, Walter, Diane said as she gathered her things. Perhaps I'll see you here again sometime. Walter nodded, attempting to mask the surge of hope her casual statement triggered. "I'll be here," he replied, trying to sound matter-of-fact. Same bench, same time. As she walked away, Walter remained seated, processing the unexpected encounter. He had spoken more in the past hour than in the entire previous week. The realization was both comforting and disturbing. How isolated he had allowed himself to become. How hungry he was for meaningful interaction. Something about Diane's attentiveness, her genuine interest without pity, had reminded him of a friendship long buried in memory. A friendship that had sustained him through one of the darkest periods of his life decades ago, though the specific connection remained elusive, dancing at the edges of his recollection. Walter gathered his newspaper, never opened, and his cane. As he stood, his knees protesting the movement. After sitting so long, he felt lighter somehow. The park looked different, more vibrant, more immediate, as if Diane's presence had adjusted the focus on a lens through which he viewed the world. Walking slowly toward the park exit, Walter wondered if she would indeed return. He was surprised to find himself hoping she would. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow and the possibility it might bring. When he reached his modest home on Maple Street, Walter didn't immediately retreat to his recliner and the droning comfort of television news, as was his custom. Instead, he walked directly to the hallway closet and stood on tiptoes to reach the highest shelf. His fingers found what they sought, an old leather-bound photo album, dusty with neglect. He didn't open it yet, but he placed it carefully on the coffee table, a quiet acknowledgement that there were parts of his past that might still matter to his future. For 6 days, Walter found himself checking the clock more frequently than usual. His normally sedentary hours now seemed to drag, each minute reluctantly giving way to the next. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday passed. The weekend stretched endlessly, and by Monday morning, Walter had convinced himself that his encounter with Diane had been an anomaly, a random act of kindness from a passing stranger. Nothing more. And yet, at 1:30 p.m. on Tuesday, Walter stood before his bathroom mirror, trimming his silver mustache with unusual care. He changed his shirt twice, finally settling on a light blue button-down that Catherine had given him last Christmas, still crisp from lack of wear. He even polished his walking shoes, a task he'd neglected for months. "You're being ridiculous, old man," he muttered to his reflection, embarrassed by his own eagerness. What was he expecting? That a young woman with her own life, her own responsibilities, would remember a promise casually made to a lonely old man in the park? Still, by 2 p.m., Walter was making his way toward Riverside Park, walking slightly faster than his usual pace. The leather-bound photo album was tucked securely under his arm, a decision he'd made and unmade a dozen times since setting it on the coffee table last week. The familiar bench awaited him, warmed by the afternoon sun. Walter settled himself, placing the album beside him, and pretended to read the newspaper while his eyes darted periodically toward the path where Diane had appeared and disappeared. By 2:45 p.m., the hope that had propelled him through the morning began to wither. He folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, preparing to leave when a voice called out, "I was afraid I'd missed you." Walter looked up to see Diane hurrying along the path, slightly out of breath, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Today she wore her hair down, brown waves framing her face, which was flushed from exertion. "Meeting ran late," she explained, dropping onto the bench beside him. "You wouldn't believe the bureaucracy involved in getting approval for a simple summer program." She paused, studying his face. "You weren't leaving, were you?" Walter smoothed the newspaper on his lap. "Just getting some circulation back in my legs," he lied, unwilling to admit he'd been on the verge of departure. "These old bones don't sit as comfortably as they used to." Diane smiled, clearly not believing him, but gracious enough not to challenge the fiction. Her gaze fell on the photo album. "What's this?" Walter's hand moved protectively to cover the album. "Just some old memories," he said, suddenly uncertain about his decision to bring it. "Nothing important." "May I?" Diane asked, her expression genuinely interested. Walter hesitated, then nodded slowly. The album had been brought for this purpose, after all, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Something about Diane had triggered a flicker of recognition that he couldn't quite place, a familiarity that had sent him digging through the past. Diane carefully opened the album, handling it with a reverence that Walter appreciated. The first pages held formal portraits: Walter and Margaret's wedding photo from 1965, Walter in his graduation robes receiving his master's degree, the couple standing proudly in front of their first house. "Your wife was beautiful," Diane commented, pausing at a photo of Margaret in her 30s, sitting on a beach blanket, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. "She was," Walter agreed, his throat tightening. "That was taken in Cape Cod, 1976, our 10th anniversary trip. Margaret loved the ocean, said it made her feel both insignificant and immortal at the same time." Diane nodded thoughtfully. "That's a profound observation. I've felt that way too, looking at the stars on clear nights." They continued through the pages, Walter providing context for each photograph: family holidays, the birth of Catherine, school events where Walter had received teaching awards, trips across the country. As they progressed, Walter found himself sharing stories he hadn't revisited in years. The pain of remembering was still there, but it was tempered now by something else: the pleasure of bearing witness to a life well lived, a life that deserved to be remembered. "You traveled quite a bit," Diane observed, turning a page filled with snapshots from national parks. Walter and Margaret beside Old Faithful, standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, dwarfed by redwoods in California. "Margaret made it her mission," Walter explained. "She kept a map with pins for every place we visited. Her goal was all 50 states before retirement." His smile faded slightly. "We made it to 46, missed Alaska, Hawaii, North Dakota, and Maine. Which one would you have visited next?" Walter didn't need to consider the question. "Maine. Margaret wanted to see the lighthouses along the coast. We had it planned for the summer after she got sick." He cleared his throat. "Cancer has its own timetable, turns out." Diane rested her hand lightly on his arm, not with pity, but with understanding. Walter appreciated that she didn't offer empty platitudes or change the subject as many did when death entered the conversation. "Tell me about your students," she said instead, turning to a page that showed Walter surrounded by teenagers, all wearing graduation caps and gowns. Walter's expression brightened. "That was the class of '92, one of my favorites." He pointed to individual faces, recounting achievements and amusing anecdotes. "This young man here, Michael Reeves, wrote a 30-page thesis on the symbolism in Melville's works at 17. He's a professor at Columbia now. And this girl, Eliza Wong, argued with me constantly about Shakespeare's relevance. Last I heard, she was directing theater in Chicago." As Walter spoke about his teaching years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each student represented a small contribution he'd made to the future, seeds planted that had grown in ways he could never have predicted. Through his stories, the classroom came alive again. The heated discussions, the breakthrough moments when a difficult concept suddenly clicked for a struggling student, the gratitude from parents who witnessed their children's intellectual awakening. "It sounds like you were an exceptional teacher," Diane said when he finally paused. "The kind students remember their whole lives." Walter shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise but secretly pleased. "I just tried to meet them where they were. Too many teachers expect students to come to them, but that's backward. You have to start with what they care about, then build bridges to what you want them to learn." "That's exactly the approach I try to use at the center," Diane said, her expression animated. "We work with kids who've been labeled difficult or unreachable by the traditional school system. But they're just disengaged because no one has connected with what matters to them." "What sort of programs do you run there?" Walter asked, genuinely curious. Diane described her work: after-school tutoring, mentorship matching, arts programs, and job skills training for teenagers from the most underserved neighborhoods in the city. Her passion was evident in the way she leaned forward, hands gesturing expressively as she outlined her vision for expanding their services. "The hardest part is funding, of course," she explained. "Grants are competitive, and private donations are inconsistent. We're always one budget cut away from having to eliminate programs that kids depend on." Walter nodded, remembering the constant battle for resources during his teaching career. "Some things never change," he said. "Society talks about valuing education and children's futures, but when it comes to putting money behind those words..." "Exactly," Diane agreed. "But we make it work. Last year, we helped 23 seniors graduate who might otherwise have dropped out. 17 of them are now in college or vocational training." "That's impressive," Walter said, meaning it. "You should be proud." As they talked, Walter became increasingly aware of a nagging sensation in the back of his mind. Something about Diane's description of her work triggered a memory he couldn't quite grasp. The feeling intensified when she mentioned a program helping teenage boys learn automotive repair skills through partnerships with local mechanics. Walter's fingers unconsciously moved to the back pocket of the photo album, where a particular photograph was tucked away, one he'd deliberately placed there last night after hours of searching through boxes in his attic. He wasn't ready to share it yet, not until he was certain about the connection he suspected. The afternoon sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the park. Diane checked her watch reluctantly. "I should get going," she said. "I promised a student I'd review his college application essay before tomorrow." Walter closed the photo album, nodding in understanding. "Of course. Don't let me keep you." As Diane gathered her belongings, she hesitated. "Same time next week?" Walter felt a rush of pleasure at the suggestion. "I'll be here," he promised, trying to keep his voice casual. Then, surprising himself, he added, "Unless you'd like to meet sooner." "I come here most days." Diane smiled. "How about Friday?" "I have a shorter day at the center." "Friday would be fine," Walter agreed, pleased by the prospect. As she turned to leave, Diane gestured to the album. "Thank you for sharing your memories with me. It means a lot that you trust me with them." After she departed, Walter remained on the bench, the album heavy on his lap. Trust. It wasn't a word he associated with his recent life. Since Margaret's death, he'd retreated from meaningful connections, convinced that at his age, the effort hardly seemed worthwhile. New relationships meant new potential losses, and he'd had enough of those. And yet, here he was, planning another meeting, sharing stories and photographs, feeling curiously alive in a way he hadn't in years. There was something about Diane, her attentiveness, her genuine interest, the way she spoke about helping young people, that resonated with forgotten parts of himself. The photograph in the album's back pocket seemed to grow heavier as Walter made his way home. Tomorrow, he would dig deeper, confirm his suspicions. By Friday, he would know whether the connection he sensed was real or merely the wishful thinking of a lonely old man desperate for meaning. Back at his house, Walter didn't return the album to its shelf. Instead, he placed it on his bedside table and, for the first time in months, set his alarm clock. Tomorrow would be a day of research, of revisiting long-closed boxes in the attic, of searching for newspaper clippings and old letters. Before turning out the light, Walter's thoughts drifted to Margaret. "You'd like her," he whispered into the darkness, as if his wife could hear. "She listens the way you did." In the quiet of his bedroom, Walter felt a curious sense of anticipation, as if after years of standing still, he had taken a step forward into unknown territory. The journey both frightened and exhilarated him. Whatever lay ahead, he was no longer merely watching life pass by from his bench. Friday arrived with a clarity of purpose Walter hadn't felt in years. The intervening days had been spent in methodical investigation, boxes from the attic examined, old address books consulted, and a trip to the library to search newspaper archives on microfilm. By the time he arrived at their bench, Walter was certain. The leather album sat heavily on his lap as he waited, its contents now organized with deliberate care. The back pocket, which had previously held just one photograph, now contained several supporting pieces of evidence: a newspaper clipping, a handwritten letter, and a faded business card. When Diane appeared, her smile warm with familiarity, Walter felt a curious mixture of anxiety and resolve. Their conversation began easily enough, with updates on their respective weeks. Diane's triumph securing a small grant for her summer program. Walter's amusement at discovering a family of cardinals nesting in his backyard maple tree. But beneath the pleasant exchange, Walter's fingers kept returning to the album, tracing its edges, preparing himself for the revelation he was about to initiate. "I brought something specific to show you today," he finally said during a natural pause in conversation. His voice was steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. Diane nodded encouragingly, having noticed his frequent glances toward the album. Walter opened it to the back pocket and carefully removed the faded photograph he'd been contemplating for days. Before showing it to Diane, he studied it once more. Two young men in their 20s, arms draped casually around each other's shoulders, standing proudly before a newly opened auto repair shop. A Kezel Festet Tabla a Bejarati Ajto Felet Olvachateau Matthews Motors. One man was Walter, his hair dark and abundant, his posture straight, his expression reflecting the confidence of youth. The other was taller, broader, with an easy smile that Walter had recognized immediately in Diane's face. "I believe," Walter said carefully, extending the photograph toward Diane, "that I knew your father." Diane's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion as she accepted the photograph. Her eyes moved quickly between the two figures, recognition dawning gradually. Her hands began to tremble. That's my dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the park. Her finger traced the outline of the taller man's face. "Robert Matthews." Walter nodded, watching emotions cascade across Diane's features, disbelief, wonder, and something deeper that made her eyes shimmer with gathering tears. He died when I was 16, Diane said, looking up at Walter with a question in her eyes. A car accident. 15 years ago now. I know, Walter replied gently. I saw the obituary, though I'd lost touch with him by then. I should have reached out to your family, but... He trailed off, the inadequacy of any explanation hanging in the air between them. How did you know him? Diane asked, her voice steadying as she returned her gaze to the photograph, drinking in the image of her father in his prime. Walter extracted the newspaper clipping from the album, a small article about the opening of Matthews Motors in 1982. Robert was my closest friend for nearly a decade, he explained. This shop was his dream. He started as a mechanic working for others, saved every penny, and finally opened his own place. The revelation left them both momentarily speechless amid the park's afternoon bustle. A jogger passed, music bleeding faintly from his headphones. Children shrieked with delight at the playground nearby. But between Walter and Diane, time seemed suspended as the implications of their connection settled around them. I don't understand, Diane finally said, her composure returning, though her eyes remained bright with unshed tears. How did we end up here, on this bench, not knowing? Walter shook his head, equally bewildered by the coincidence. I've been asking myself the same question. Did you choose this bench for a reason that day? No, Diane replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. I just needed a break from work. I'd never sat here before. She paused, considering. But my dad used to bring me to this park when I was little. He said it was his thinking place. Walter felt a chill move through him at this revelation. The park had been Robert's favorite spot to talk through problems or celebrate successes. How many times had they sat on these very benches, plotting business strategies or discussing personal challenges? There's more, Walter said, reaching for the letter in the album's pocket. Robert helped me during the most difficult time of my life. I lost my teaching position during budget cuts in '83. Nearly lost our house. Robert hired me at his shop despite my complete lack of mechanical knowledge. Diane listened, rapt, as Walter detailed a chapter of her father's life she'd never known. His generosity in hiring a liberal arts teacher to manage his books and front desk. The loan he'd provided to keep Walter's mortgage afloat. The friendship that had sustained both men through personal and professional challenges. He never mentioned this, Diane said, wonder in her voice. I knew he helped people, but I never knew about you specifically. He wasn't one to broadcast his good deeds, Walter replied with a sad smile. That wasn't his way. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, they remained on the bench, piecing together their shared history. Walter shared stories Diane had never heard. Her father's boundless pride when she'd won the state debate championship at 14, his worry during her rebellious phase, his plans to help fund her college education. In turn, Diane filled in the years Walter had missed, her father's business expansion, his community leadership, the terrible night of the accident that had left her and her mother to rebuild their lives around his absence. I wish I'd stayed in touch, Walter said, regret heavy in his voice. After Margaret got pregnant with Catherine, our lives took different directions. Robert was working 60-hour weeks at the shop, and I'd returned to teaching. We meant to get together, but... Diane nodded in understanding. Life happens. Dad was the same way, always intending to reconnect with old friends, but never finding the time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Walter carefully returned the photograph to its place in the album. But before closing it, he pressed it into Diane's hands. This belongs with you now, he said firmly. "There are more pictures of your father in here, from that period of our friendship. Things you should have." Diane began to protest, but Walter raised his hand to stop her. "I have my memories. You should have the tangible reminders." They parted that evening with a new understanding between them. No longer strangers who had chanced to meet, but participants in a story that had begun decades before. Unwitting carriers of a connection neither had known they shared. As Walter made his slow way home in the gathering dusk, he felt Robert's presence more strongly than he had in years. Not as a ghost, but as a thread in the complex tapestry that had brought him and Diane together on that park bench one ordinary Tuesday afternoon. For the first time since Margaret's death, Walter felt the weight of isolation lifting, replaced by something he had thought forever lost. The sense of being part of something larger than himself, a story still unfolding. The weeks following their revelation unfolded in a gentle rhythm of discovery. Walter and Diane began meeting twice weekly, Tuesdays and Fridays, their park bench becoming the center of a gradually expanding universe of shared memories and connections. Each meeting brought new artifacts from their respective homes. Walter arriving with folders of old correspondence, receipts from fishing trips, and even a faded business plan written in Robert's distinctive handwriting. Diane contributed her own treasures: her father's high school yearbook, family photos Walter had never seen, and a collection of birthday cards that Robert had written to his daughter, each one preserved with careful attention. Together, they assembled a more complete portrait of Robert Matthews than either had possessed individually. Walter filled in the gaps of Robert's early adulthood, his ambitions, his struggles to secure a business loan in a skeptical market, his unwavering optimism even when facing setbacks. These stories provided Diane with a dimension of her father she had glimpsed but never fully understood as a child. He was constantly taking risks, Walter explained during one afternoon session, showing Diane a napkin on which Robert had sketched his vision for expanding the auto shop. The bank rejected his first 3 loan applications, but he kept refining his business plan, addressing every criticism until they couldn't say no. Diane nodded, recognition brightening her eyes. "That explains so much about how he raised me. He always pushed me to persevere, to see rejection as temporary." She smiled at a memory. "When I didn't make the debate team in freshman year, he made me practice arguments with him every night for months. Next year, I was team captain." In return, Diane shared stories of Robert as a father, his Sunday morning pancake tradition, his insistence on teaching her basic auto mechanics despite her initial resistance, his unwavering presence at every school event despite his punishing work schedule. Walter absorbed these domestic details hungrily, filling in the picture of his friend's life after their paths had diverged. The most significant revelation came when Diane brought a journal her father had kept sporadically during her teenage years. Within its pages, Walter discovered multiple references to himself. Robert wondering how old Walt was doing, considering reaching out after seeing a newspaper article about Walter receiving a teaching award, expressing regret about lost connections as he reflected on his 50th birthday. "He never forgot you," Diane said softly, watching Walter's fingers trace the handwritten lines. "Even though you'd fallen out of touch." This discovery sparked Walter's own excavation into his teaching files, where he found a recommendation letter Robert had written for Walter's application to return to teaching, a powerful testimonial that had helped secure his position at Lincoln High. Walter had forgotten this crucial intervention, one of many instances of Robert's quiet support that had shaped the trajectory of his career and life. Their exploration extended beyond memories and artifacts. One Tuesday, Diane suggested they visit Matthews Motors, now owned by Robert's former apprentice, but still operating under the original name. The visit proved emotional for both, Walter confronting physical spaces unchanged since he'd last seen them, Diane connecting her childhood memories of visiting her father at work with Walter's stories of the shop's early days. The current owner, Miguel Ramirez, welcomed them warmly, sharing his own stories of Robert's mentorship. "Everything I know about running a business with integrity, I learned from Mr. Matthews," he told them, leading them through the expanded facility that had grown from Robert's modest beginning. "When he offered to sell me the business before his accident, I thought he was crazy to trust me with it. But he said he'd rather sell to someone who loved it than someone who could just pay the highest price." Another afternoon found them at the community center where Diane worked, Walter observing her interactions with the teenagers in her programs. The parallel between her teaching approach and Robert's mentorship style struck Walter forcefully. The same patience, the same insistence on high standards, coupled with unwavering support. The same ability to see potential where others saw only problems. As Walter watched Diane guide a reluctant boy through a difficult math problem, he saw Robert's techniques translated into a new context. The gentle persistence, the strategic questions that led to self-discovery rather than dependence. The lineage was clear, though Diane had developed these skills without conscious awareness of their origin. "You're very much your father's daughter," Walter commented afterward as they walked back to their bench. "He would be extraordinarily proud of what you're doing here." Diane's eyes brightened at the comparison. "That's the highest compliment you could give me," she said. "I've always hoped I was carrying forward his legacy somehow." Their conversations gradually expanded beyond Robert to include their own lives. Walter sharing stories of his late wife Margaret, their travels, their struggles raising Catherine through difficult teenage years. Diane spoke of her college experiences, her brief marriage that had ended amicably 2 years prior, her ambitions for expanding the community center's impact. The generational gap between them, initially a potential barrier, became instead a bridge. Walter offering perspective from his decades of experience, Diane bringing fresh insights and contemporary contexts that Walter, in his isolation, had missed. 3 months after their first meeting, they found themselves discussing the scholarship fund Diane was attempting to establish at the center, a program to help promising students pursue college or vocational training without the burden of crushing debt. "We've identified at least 6 kids this year who have the academic qualifications, but not the financial means," Diane explained, frustration evident in her voice. "We've secured partial funding through grants, but it's not enough." Walter listened thoughtfully, an idea forming that had been percolating for weeks. The next day, he visited his bank, then his lawyer, setting in motion a plan that would honor both Robert's memory and the unexpected connection that had brought him and Diane together. As autumn painted Riverside Park in blazing colors, Walter and Diane's bench remained their anchor, a place where the past and present converged, where a chance encounter had revealed the invisible threads connecting their lives across decades. The photograph that had sparked their recognition now sat framed in Diane's office at the community center, a daily reminder of the legacy she was continuing in ways neither she nor her father could have foreseen. On a crisp October morning, Walter stood outside the Westside Community Center, checking his watch and smoothing the lapels of his seldom-worn suit jacket. Inside his breast pocket rested an envelope, the culmination of weeks of financial planning, legal consultations, and deep reflection. The center hummed with activity as Walter entered, teenagers moving purposefully between classrooms, volunteers arranging materials for afternoon programs. Walter had become a familiar figure here over the past months, occasionally sharing his teaching experience with Diane's students, or simply observing the transformative work being done in these modest surroundings. Today, he had come to observe Diane's college preparation workshop, a weekly session helping high school seniors navigate the intimidating landscape of applications, essays, and financial aid forms. Walter slipped quietly into the back of the classroom, watching as Diane moved among the students, addressing individual questions with focused attention. Her approach reminded Walter powerfully of Robert, the same ability to make each person feel uniquely valued, the same insistence on excellence coupled with practical support to achieve it. From his vantage point, Walter could see the legacy of his old friend continuing through his daughter, touching lives that Robert himself would never know. When the session ended, students gathered their materials, several stopping to thank Diane or schedule individual follow-up meetings. Walter noticed one young man lingering, uncertainty evident in his posture. Diane spent extra time with him, their conversation too quiet for Walter to hear, but the boy's expression gradually shifted from resignation to cautious hope. Martin was ready to abandon his college applications, Diane explained later as she joined Walter. His family needs him to work full-time after graduation. I was trying to explain how scholarships might make it possible for him to do both. Walter nodded, the envelope in his pocket suddenly feeling even more significant. "Do you have time for coffee?" he asked. "There's something I'd like to discuss." They walked to a small cafe adjacent to the center, claiming a quiet corner table. After ordering, Walter carefully extracted the envelope and placed it between them. "When your father and I were young men," he began, choosing his words deliberately, "he did something that changed the course of my life. When I lost my teaching position during budget cuts, I was 3 months behind on mortgage payments. The bank was threatening foreclosure." Diane listened intently, having heard parts of this story, but recognizing from Walter's tone that he was approaching something new. "Robert loaned me $20,000, Walter continued. "An enormous sum in 1983. He called it an investment in my future, refused to let me sign a formal agreement, and wouldn't accept a penny of interest when I finally repaid him years later." Walter opened the envelope, removing a bank check and sliding it across the table. $25,000 represents the modern equivalent of what your father loaned me, adjusted for inflation. Diane's eyes widened as she stared at the check made out to the Westside Community Center Scholarship Fund. "Walter, I can't. It's not for you," Walter interrupted gently. "It's for your students, for young people like Martine who need someone to invest in their futures, just as your father invested in mine." His voice softened. "Robert helped me keep my home and eventually put Catherine through college. The trajectory of my entire family's life changed because of his generosity." Diane stared at the check, conflicting emotions playing across her features. "This is an incredible amount of money, Walter. Are you sure you can?" "I've consulted my financial advisor," Walter assured her. "Margaret and I lived modestly, saved diligently. Catherine is established in her career, and my needs are few." He smiled. "Besides, what better use for these resources than continuing Robert's legacy of transforming lives through education and opportunity?" After initial reluctance, Diane accepted the donation with the grace Walter had come to expect from her. Together, they drafted guidelines for the Robert Matthews Memorial Scholarship, a fund that would prioritize students demonstrating both academic promise and financial need, with special consideration for those interested in either education or skilled trades, honoring both Walter's and Robert's professional paths. In the weeks that followed, their relationship evolved further. Walter began volunteering regularly at the center, offering his decades of teaching experience to support Diane's programs. His presence among the teenagers was initially met with skepticism, but his authentic interest in their lives and his lack of condescension gradually earned their respect. For Walter, these interactions provided a renewed sense of purpose. Each time he helped a student craft a college essay or understand a difficult text, he felt the weight of isolation that had enveloped him after Margaret's death lifting further. His knowledge, his experiences, even his struggles, were becoming resources for others rather than burdens to be carried alone. For Diane, Walter's presence offered something equally valuable, a connection to her father that transcended memories and photographs. Through Walter's stories, mentorship approach, and friendship, Robert's spirit remained alive in tangible, evolving ways. The scholarship fund they created together would ensure that connection extended to future generations of students, many not yet born when Robert died. On a particularly golden afternoon in late October, 6 months after their first encounter, Walter and Diane returned to their bench in Riverside Park. The trees blazed with autumn colors, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of distant wood smoke. "I received a letter from Catherine yesterday," Walter mentioned as they watched a young family feed the ducks at the pond's edge. "She's considering a visit for Thanksgiving with the grandchildren." Diane smiled. "That's wonderful news. Will this be their first trip since Margaret passed?" Walter nodded. "Catherine's been hesitant. I think she's afraid of the memories." He paused, considering his next words. "I've told her about you, about our connection through Robert. She remembers him vaguely from her childhood." "I'd like to meet her," Diane said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the park's rhythms, joggers circling the path, children climbing playground equipment, couples strolling hand in hand. Walter marveled at how differently he experienced these scenes now compared to 6 months ago. What had once been reminders of his isolation were now simply the varied movements of a community to which he, once again, belonged. "I've been thinking about Maine," Diane said unexpectedly. Walter turned to her, questioning. "Maine? You mentioned it was the state you and Margaret never got to visit. The lighthouses." Diane's expression was thoughtful. "I have vacation time accumulated. Maybe next summer we could make that trip." The suggestion caught Walter by surprise, a future unfolding where he'd assumed none existed. "I'd like that," he said finally, his voice slightly unsteady. Margaret would have liked it too. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, they walked together along the park's winding paths that Robert Matthews had once traveled, thinking his own thoughts, making his own choices, unaware of how the ripples of his generosity would continue decades after his death, connecting lives in ways he could never have imagined. Walter, who had come to this park to sit alone with his memories, now found himself moving forward, participating once again in the ongoing story of human connection. The weight of memory remained: Margaret's absence, the years of isolation, the opportunities missed with Robert. But that weight had transformed from a burden into a foundation, supporting whatever remained of his journey. As they reached the park entrance, Walter thought about the photograph that had bridged past and present. 2 young men standing before a new beginning, unaware of how their futures would intertwine and separate and intertwine again through the lives of those who came after them. That image now graced the brochure for the Robert Matthews Memorial Scholarship, ensuring that a friendship formed decades ago would continue to shape lives long after both friends had departed. "Same time Tuesday?" Diane asked as they prepared to part ways. Walter nodded, certainty replacing the hesitation that had characterized their early meetings. "I'll be there," he promised, knowing it was true not just for Tuesday, but for all the days to come. The bench that had once been his solitary outpost was now their shared anchor, a place where past and future converged, where a chance encounter had completed a circle that Robert had begun long ago, and where new circles were already forming, expanding outward in ways neither Walter nor Diane could yet imagine.